Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we are so happy to have as our guest, Alexander Alvarado. Alexander is a clinical psychologist and founder of Thriving Center of Psychology. He says that many people seek therapy when facing a breaking point, be it in a relationship, career, or other big life moment. A breaking point is a major event that finally is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. Other people really reach out for help sooner. So we'll talk to Alex about what is the way to go. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex.
Thank you so much for having me, Ellen.
Let's go back in time and talk about what led you to your career as a clinical psychologist as a little boy. Let's start there.
Sure. I'd actually say my mother was a therapist as well. So that definitely helped guide me in the right direction. But I knew from a pretty young age that psychology was likely going to be in whatever I studied, marketing, business, people relations, psychology, seeing clients. So I knew it was a good direction to go in because it was very likely it would help me in one way or the other. So that's probably what led me down the path as a young boy, I'd say.
And so what kind of training did you pursue?
Sure. Yeah. So undergrad, I was a psychology major. And then I jumped right into graduate school to get my doctorate of psychology, which is about six years. And a residency. And so that was the training. It's about 10 years of studying altogether.
So that is really deep, complex, and intense, because one thing I'm finding is sometimes people not really well trained like yourself, they're doing something called health coaching. And they could really, have nowhere near the knowledge and depth that you have with all that training.
Yeah, coaching it's almost a very delicate word to throw around clinical psychologists, just because you're exactly right. Anyone can kind of throw out a shingle as a coach. But there are some, good coaches, and a lot of psychologists also pursue coaching in a psychological, clinical psychology way. So I would still be very delicate whenever you're approaching a quote coach.
Now, we're hearing in the news, at least I've been hearing in the news lately, how very little psychotherapeutic type help is, and that people seem to need it more than ever since the entire COVID shutdown.
Yeah, definitely. The need has definitely gone up, and it's something we've seen at our center, at Thriving Center, all across the board, in every state where we're in. The need has been up, and also the access has also been up as well. Before COVID, there was telemedicine for sure, but I would say after COVID, it really skyrocketed, where it's almost the norm now in a sense. I would say most places, people are probably utilizing telemedicine more than going into an actual office and seeing a therapist.
Well, I personally have experienced that specifically with a therapist, and I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was actually better for me. Let's say I'm the client in this situation, because I've also used telemedicine as the provider. That really, it's the convenience level, of not having to get in a car and go somewhere and park. And then when you're done, you can just, shut the computer off and be very reflective. I thought more would be lost in terms of the energetics of that interpersonal connection, but it really doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it depends on state to state. Since we're in a few different states, we can see the difference in terms of convenience, obviously. Places like New York City, it's actually for a lot of people more convenient to come into in office. They're not living with a lot of space a lot of times. Sometimes they're sharing apartments with roommates. So it's hard for them to get, a quiet space to themselves. I think during COVID, we had some clients doing therapy on their fire escape in like the freezing cold. So, but then there's places like Los Angeles where I don't know if you've ever driven in Los Angeles during some of the most sought out times for therapy, which is between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. It's like gridlock traffic. So Los Angeles is a place I could see us really. I could see teletherapy basically being the primary care over there.
So your organization is called Therapy Center of Psychology. Is that your organization, or are you part of a group that is much larger?
Sure. Yeah. So Thriving Center of Psychology. I founded the organization, and it's I wouldn't say large, it's a medium organization. There's around 100 therapists in about 6 states. We just entered in Illinois and Massachusetts, so soon to be 8. But yeah, so we're in most metropolitan areas.
Oh, okay. That's fabulous. So then you get highly trained therapists to be part of Thriving Center of Psych. That's how people have to look it up. Thriving Center of Psychology. And by the way, we will have a live link under your bio on our website after the show is done airing today. Then we also have everything archived, which is just really a wonderful service for our listeners. And that's a good way for people to get in touch with you. Now, I know does your organization do children at all?
We have some therapists who do see children and adolescents. However, the primary population that we do see is at the adult population.
Because I actually have a granddaughter, and she's in New Jersey. And she's very young, but she's had a lot of trauma in her life. And I did have someone going to the house, which worked very well, but that person is no longer available. So I'm actually looking for such a person again. And for a child, I don't know how well that interface works in terms of doing it on the computer, because then someone else would have to sit there with her. I mean, she's 6.
Yeah, you'd actually be surprised. I mean, we have people utilizing telehealth with children as young as 3. So there's ways to do it. It's definitely, there's some barriers for sure in terms of keeping them focused, especially depending on, what they're coming in for. But, people during the pandemic, when we were locked down, it was, all we could do. So, there's ways that we've learned to kind of adapt in those situations.
Well, it sounds like it's a wonderful organization, and people can definitely find you online. I want to just reintroduce our audience to you, Alex. So you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, and today my guest is Dr. Alexander Alvarado, and he is a Psych D. And he has an organization called Thriving Center of Psychology. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and their own website, which is lovely. I just looked at it, thrivingcenterofpsych.com. So, Dr. Alvarado, what are some of the mistakes people make unknowingly if they are deciding they might be seeking therapy?
Yeah, and seeking therapy is such an overwhelming process, and especially when people get to that point, it almost provides another barrier because of all the resources that we have. So I would say what we usually see is the biggest mistakes people make are just taking the most convenient options, almost out of desperation. And some of those convenient options include the number one hit on Google, right? Just because someone's the most, or the best marketed therapist doesn't necessarily mean they're the best therapist for you. Another convenient option is referrals from friends or family, which again, just because that therapist was the best for your friend or family member doesn't mean they're the best for you. Your friend or family member might have been coming in for a particular situation, or maybe you need to come in for a particular situation. Now, I will say both of these, options are great starting points. However, people fall into the trap of that being their end all be all.
That's true. And in our initial introduction to you, you talk about what leads people to feel like they need therapy? I know you're talking about couples therapy with some, very famous people like Will and Jada Smith, Tiger Woods and Naomi Osaka, but not everybody is that high profile and has like, oh my God, Tiger Woods, fights with people in their car, and gets his window bashed in. I mean, I'm hoping most people don't get to that point.
Yeah. There's all different reasons for depending on the person. Major life events, of course, are a big one. Sometimes it's a progression of just things that build up, and if someone finally gets to that quote tipping point that they need to go in, and what we try to do is really just decrease that last barrier, because once they get to the tipping point, that's one barrier to get through, and then it's the barrier of okay, now where do I start? We're so lucky in this day and age to have so many resources for mental health, which was a lot different from, 5-10 years ago. But with that comes a few different issues. And that is, where do I look? What's a trusted, resource, and which one is a quality resource? And, it's really tough, especially not being in this industry, to be able to just look at some of these resources and say, okay, this is a good one.
Well, because someone as highly trained as yourself would know that there are a lot of different treatment styles and also different therapeutic modalities are taught within psych. What are some of your favorite that you have found work well, and with what population?
Great question. And so some of, you're definitely, you hit the nose or hit it right on the nose in terms of the amount of therapeutic modalities, as they call them, in this industry. And they range, there's a whole list. And the ones that we usually look for, and this is not all of them, but cognitive behavioral therapy is a huge one that works very well, has a lot of research behind it. Well,
wait, tell us, you can go a little bit more deeply, like somebody just heard that word for the first time. What does that mean to you with your knowledge?
Sure. And, trust me, I could do a whole podcast probably
on sure.
cognitive behavioral therapy, but I'll break it down in almost the most simplest form. And it basically incorporates three different parts, right? Thoughts, feelings, and emotions, right? Theory basically states that when we change two, the third will follow, right? If we can change behaviors and possibly your thoughts, then emotions will be the final one to change. So I would say that's like the elevator pitch, boiling down to what CBT really involves.
Okay.
Another great modality is called acceptance and commitment therapy. It's almost a little branch off of CBT and very kind of new age, where a lot of research is pulling into. If you ever listen to some of the big names like Brene Brown, she's very into ACT. And that's a lot about, value-based living, finding out or understanding, what really matters to you and kind of going down that path and, following behaviors down that path, even though it doesn't always feel like the right behavior, in a sense of like, for instance, let's say if you went through a recent breakup with someone who wasn't good to you, and in your heart it's not the good idea to text them back, but you really want to. However, ACT would say stick to your values, and even though you feel like texting them, you could still not text them. Something similar to that. So I would say those two are my top favorite in terms of, especially the population that we tend to work with, which is a lot of times the higher functioning population.
So you're talking about that, and that sounds mostly like couples, like couple problems.
Well, that is a relationship issue. I would say that's probably past the couples point. They're probably not.
Oh, you're right. Right. It's the uncoupling point.
Yes, exactly. There's different types of even couples therapy modalities as well. A big one is Gottman. John Gottman is a researcher and psychologist in the couples realm, and is notorious for all of his research in couples. So honestly, Google searching all of these things is really important in understanding, the modalities of what your therapist does. Because
different therapists are trained in different ones. When I was in college, I actually went for something called Gestalt Therapy. And
Sure.
that was very intense. I will tell you, it really changed my entire view of life.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of, and it's interesting too, you will find once you do a lot of studying in some of these modalities, there's some overlap, there's a lot of overlap and just kind of twists to the terms. So that's why I feel like there are so many, and just for some therapists, just some make more sense to them and in that sense.
So if someone is, let's say, going to your website at Thriving Center of Psychology, what would they look for? I mean, they may not know that they want ACT versus Gestalt versus any other one. I mean, how would one know?
Sure. Yeah. So first and foremost, I don't think they would know. And I think the biggest piece of what you're looking for is this therapeutic modality based in research, right? Is it an evidence-based modality? Because there's a lot of, like we just mentioned, a lot of different methodologies of therapy, and they range from different amounts of research that are behind them. So I would always make sure that it isn't what they call an evidence-based treatment as defined by the American Psychological Association. And when you go to our website, every single person, we're pretty, maybe even too strict on evidence-based treatments. We make sure that every single person that comes onto the team is highly specialized in evidence-based treatment modalities. And it could be ACT, CBT, or any of the a few other ones, but those two are probably our biggest. And so, I mentioned like we're a medium-sized company because we're very selective. We're not. There's a lot of larger companies out there, especially I'm sure you'll hear, that just want as many therapists as possible, and I think that's great. But we kind of there's a whole interview process that you should do when you're meeting a therapist, and obviously if you're not in this industry, it's kind of hard to know what those answers to those questions are.
Absolutely.
So we try to,
that's what I'm saying. Right. How would you know what you want?
So we try to do that for people, we have two senior psychologists who are the only people that interview the people that get brought on. And, obviously they're the ones that know the answers of, does this person know what they're talking about? And, do they understand evidence-based treatments, right? If I was someone outside this industry asking someone, so how do you usually treat people with, anxiety? I wouldn't know the answer to that. The person could probably tell me whatever. So, we try to really help people with those steps and ask those questions for clients and really make sure the people that we bring on understand what they're doing and who they're treating.
So if a therapist wants to work with you, they're kind of working with you as a referral service.
Yeah. So what we've built is actually a 5-minute questionnaire on our site to really help.
That's a good place for an individual to start.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. That is the perfect place to start. We have a 5-minute questionnaire, basically just asking the clients in terms of, obviously some important questions of why they're coming in, but even what type of therapist would they feel most comfortable with? Because there's two parts to really, in my mind, matching someone with a qualified therapist. One, making sure they're qualified, and then two, making sure they're the right person for, that client, because, that rapport, that connection is one of the most important things in the therapeutic process. So some of these questions that people might fill out are, would you like your provider to be someone in the LGBTQ population, or a person of color, or someone more goal-oriented, right? If you're coming in for maybe something like, something that requires goals, like I'm trying to do a speech at my daughter's wedding and I'm terrified, or I want to get on a plane. Or is someone more reflective, right? Meaning someone who, I have a lot to process and I want someone to really listen to me and provide feedback. So we have about, I think, 14 questions there to really help us narrow down which one of our providers are the best fit.
And within this, I think that's a nice name, that you have a therapy matchmaking quiz.
Yeah.
So on your site, there's something people can, access. And I imagine it's free on the site to start to look at who might be best for them. Is there any way to screen if people have waited till they are, ready to jump out of the window and they're suicidal? Would you pick that up at all?
So this whole matchmaker is not it's not like an automated process. Like a robot doesn't spit out your matches. It really gets thrown to our office managers who provide matches and then also follow up with calls to each of the people filling out this matchmaker. So through that call, just to get a better understanding of the questions they filled out, we usually have a little bit of a screening there. And then following that, we also have our intake forms that get filled out before the confirmed appointment. So, if we don't get something screened there, we usually see it on the questionnaire.
Because some people do, they, especially men, I have to say, I know you're a man, but not to be sexist, but I would say men find it much more difficult to reach out for therapy until it's like dire.
Yes. Yeah. No. And I mean, look, there's a stigma in mental health in general, and you're right. Unfortunately, there's more of that stigma in our society with men. Right, men are taught to be strong, or almost that. I guess that in the traditional sense, that showing feelings could be a sign of weakness. And I think what we're seeing, which is great, is that that's starting to decrease. It's still there, but it's definitely starting to decrease in the most recent years. And I think a lot of public figures, men, have come out and talked about therapy and how beneficial it's been. Every sports team uses a psychologist, so that's been a huge help. So I think it's been so mainstream. But you're still right. The stigma definitely is more with men than women.
Yeah, I guess that's true as the generations, because I think about my son, who's a very masculine guy. He's 47 years old, and he's always had therapy and gone to men's group, and, he'll be with a group of his very masculine guys. He's also an athlete, and they'll kind of openly, oh yeah, this and that about a therapy session, where my age men, like 75 or so, no, not so much.
Mm-hmm. It's even funny. I mean, it's common conversation these days, talking about going to your therapist, in social settings, which I don't think was the norm just even a few years ago.
Well, it was with women.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely much more opening up on that, on that male end, which is, really great. Now, when people want therapy, is it something that's covered by health insurance?
Sure. So, it really depends on the therapist. There's a lot of therapists who do take insurance and some are out of network. And it really depends on where you are too, because a lot of places such as New York City, it could be difficult to find someone that they call in network. However, there's a lot of insurance companies, depending on your plan, who might actually cover on an out-of-network basis, your therapy appointment. So there's a lot of, if you have a PPO, what they call it, that means very likely that your insurance will pay for your session after you pay for your session, essentially. So it depends, it's a location thing. You'll probably see in more rural locations that it's a lot easier to find a therapist in network, where more metropolitan cities, it might be a little bit more difficult, but they are out there.
Right. And that's something that you could seek after you sort of go and start filling some forms out about who might be best for you at Thriving Center of Psychology. So what about this whole new thing with telehealth? Because I believe that was not the case, where you could just actually visit with therapists from other states.
Sure. Yeah. So technically, you still should see a therapist the therapist doesn't have to be in your state. They just have to be licensed in your state, right? They could be in, Alabama if you're in New York and they have a license in New York. But there are some programs that are going through legislation that are allowing a lot of therapists in different states to also practice via telehealth in other states. So it's really decreased a lot of the barriers and has helped connect a lot of providers no matter what state they're in.
Yeah, that's basically a whole new thing.
Yeah. I mean, telehealth's been around. I was doing telehealth, years before it's COVID, but even, just a very, very lesser extent. And it was never the preference, so it is just skyrocketed, I'd say.
It has. And I think that's a good thing. In fact, for not just mental health, but even physical health, the fact that you can now be on camera and show a doctor a rash and he could go, run to the emergency room. Or you know what? Put calamine lotion on it, and it'll usually be right, he or she. I think that's phenomenal.
Oh yeah. You can get an appointment within an hour, some places. So it's really been great.
Yeah, for everybody. So that's, when there's terrible things like, the whole COVID crisis has certainly been, I think, terrible for people's mental health. I mean, the isolation.
Right. Yeah, no, that was a big thing for sure. People not having any connection to anyone. We had people in some of our locations who, went without seeing another human being for, 6 months. So that definitely has an effect on mental health.
And I would say with the lack of stigma, the increased availability, with telehealth and with all these things, it would be a great idea to look into that if you're not feeling happy. You don't have to feel ecstatic, but if you're feeling worried more than you used to, I mean, the price of gas alone could make people have to go to a therapist. And the fact
groceries.
Groceries and gas. So, that's something where people are interested is like, will this therapy be covered? And sometimes it will be. You can look into that. So the first place to start is at Thriving Center of Psychology, and then people can do the quiz that you have online and see where that goes. Then they'll get some kind of feedback.
Yeah, the best rule of thumb I like to say is that if you've been thinking about going to a therapist, chances are it's time. There's probably a reason it's gone to your head or gone through your head. And that's usually a good rule of thumb.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest today. And that was, you obviously have a lot more information. We'll go deeper at another time. We've been speaking to Alexander Alvarado, a doctor of psychology, and you can see more at thrivingcenterofpsychology.com. And then, of course, all the usual from that, Facebook, Instagram, etc. So thank you so much for being our guest today, Alexander.
Ellen, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai, at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.